another edition of the Alturas Institute's presentation of a YouTube talk on timely constitutional issues. I'm Dr. David Adler, president of the Alturas Institute and a constitutional scholar. Today, we're celebrating the large number of viewers and subscribers and the many questions that you've submitted. Well over 700 questions since our last talk a week or so ago. And so I wanted to take up a few of these questions today because there's a lot of anxiety in America from coast to coast surrounding the last month of President Donald Trump's administration and lingering questions about the pardon power. How interesting it is that the pardon power now captures headlines and indeed represents page one news across the nation's newspapers. So let's take up a few questions today, and I invite you to submit additional questions since this is, for the first time, a YouTube live talk presented by the Alturas Institute. Thanks again for joining us. To my surprise, many of you had ongoing questions about President Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon in September of 1974. If you remember, when President Gerald Ford ascended to the presidency, he was interviewed by the House Judiciary Committee. This is in early August of 1974, and he was asked directly, "Do you intend to pardon President Nixon?" And Gerald Ford responded by saying no, the nation wouldn't stand for it. A pardon before trial would be premature and would undercut the rule of law. Lo and behold, a month later, nonetheless, the newly ascendant President Gerald Ford decided to grant a pardon to Richard Nixon for any and all offenses that he may have committed against the United States from the time that he assumed the presidency in 1968 until this very date. And that alarmed many Americans. And we noted previously that the decision by Gerald Ford may well have cost him the 1976 presidential election. It was a very narrow loss to President Jimmy Carter. Your questions, I'm happy to say, are focused on the critical issue of whether or not Gerald Ford cut a deal with President Richard Nixon in the last days of the Nixon White House. This issue arose because a number of newspapermen and other writers at that time wrote extensively on the question, did Gerald Ford cut a deal? What was the deal? I told you in a previous talk that I did not think that Gerald Ford cut a deal with Richard Nixon. That is a quid pro quo. In other words, you resign the presidency, I become president, and in return for your resignation, I will, in fact, grant you a presidential pardon. I shared the story of how many years later, I was fortunate enough to be in a small group of faculty and students at my university when Gerald Ford visited. We had a small talk, we had lunch. I thought it in my responsibility to ask President Ford if, in fact, he ever cut a deal. Gerald Ford responded, no, he never did that, didn't even consider it. And so I shared with you my own view of great doubt about Gerald Ford cutting such a deal, and here's why. There was nothing in it for Gerald Ford. That is, there was no value for him to agree to accept Nixon's resignation in return for his own grant of a pardon. Why was there nothing in it for him? Because Nixon was going to resign. Everybody knew that. It was simply a matter of days, at the most weeks. And so when Alexander Haig, representing Richard Nixon, came to Gerald Ford and raised that question of resignation for a presidential pardon, I believe Gerald Ford had no incentive to do it because there was no reason to do it. He was going to become president, as I say, in a matter of days or weeks. And so when some of your questions to me expressed surprise at my position, at my conclusion, indicating perhaps some naivete, I would want to say once more, the important thing to keep in mind here is that there was no reason for Gerald Ford to have cut a deal, to have sullied his reputation forever and ever because he was about to become president. in just hours, days, or weeks. But I really appreciate your asking those questions. And in fact, you're playing your roles as good citizens by your questioning those who present views about governmental officials, because the name of the game in American democracy is governmental accountability. That's our responsibility as citizens, as James Madison put it to us. And so I always think of US citizens playing the role as Madisonian monitors. Other questions still surround the exercise of the pardon power, ranging from will Donald Trump pardon himself to will he pardon his children? And what if he pardons himself and a lawsuit is brought? Could the court overturn the exercise of the pardon power? So let's take these up. Number one, as I've previously indicated, the President of the United States cannot possibly possess the authority under the pardoning power to pardon himself. The framers of the Constitution would have found such an assertion unconscionable. And you'll recall the tidbit I shared with you. Deep inside the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention in 1787, a number of the framers winced at the possibility that the president would be granted the pardon power, winced because they were keenly familiar with the way in which English kings had abused their power, often to serve their own personal or political interests. And so the question for the framers was, how are we going to stop the president from pardoning aides and cronies who might do his dirty work, so to speak, and to carry out perhaps even treasonous activities, knowing that if the president possessed the pardon power, he might pardon those aides and cronies who were covering up for his own actions. Thus, the exercise of the pardon power, granting it to aides and cronies, might essentially represent an effort by the president to pardon himself. That was unconscionable, as I say. And in that moment of darkness inside the Constitutional Convention, it was Alexander Hamilton who warned that if a president abuses the pardon power, that he would in fact be subjected to impeachment. George Mason of Virginia added that the impeachment power was available to stop a president from pardoning his friends and his assistants and his aides in any kind of a treasonous activity. So what we have here was the framers' keen sense that the availability of the pardon power would be met at every turn by the availability of the impeachment power if in fact there were evidence of abuse. So the very fact that the president, in this case President Trump, might attempt to pardon himself would run afoul of the deepest concerns possessed by the framers in Philadelphia. If a president could not pardon aides and cronies and friends to cover up his own treacherous activity, surely the president could not assert authority to pardon himself to cover up his own misdeeds and perhaps treacherous activities. So it's a non-starter. However, we're talking about a president here in the figure of Donald Trump, who for 4 years has pushed over constitutional principles, democratic norms, held little regard for the rule of law and our constitutional tradition. So it is possible. Indeed, I speculated that he may already have pardoned himself, signed it, locked it away in a vault somewhere. Suppose that President Trump does indeed or has indeed pardoned himself for any offenses that he may have committed against the United States from the day he assumed office up until the end of his presidency on January 20. What would the Supreme Court, if indeed a lawsuit were brought, what would the Supreme Court rule on this question? Could it be overturned? Could the pardon be reversed? The answer, I think, is yes. And even though this is a novel question, it's unprecedented because, as you all know, no president ever in our history has ever seriously flirted with the idea of a self-pardon. And so it's an open question, we would say, but we don't have to conclude that merely because it's an unprecedented question that we're completely in the dark with respect to our speculation about what the legal system would permit and what it would prohibit, because in the event of the president pardoning himself and the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, if you like this hypothetical, the court could strike it down based on a couple of factors, one of which I just shared with you, and that is the framers in writing the pardon clause could not have contemplated the very prospect of a presidential self-pardon. Secondly, if you look at the language of Article 2, and it says the president may grant pardons for offenses against the United States, it's very clear that the use of the word grant refers to a presidential pardon for others. He cannot grant to himself a pardon. So both the language of Article 2, but most importantly, the history behind Article 2 and the pardon power make a convincing case that the president may not pardon himself. As we said earlier, there are a bunch of other arguments, not the least of which is that the president would be, in that case, judge and jury of his own cause, which would violate one of the great historic legal history pillars of all time, all the way back to 1610 in the famous Dr. Bonham's case, when Sir Edward Coke, who worked enormous influence over the development of our legal system, held that in fact no man may be judge and jury of his own cause. And in addition, and most importantly, it would place the president above the law. So it's unconscionable, it's absurd for the president to assert the authority. Let's hope that the president doesn't drive the country to this constitutional crisis, but at this point, all bets are off. A number of you raise a very interesting question. Could President Trump pardon his children? It has been speculated that he might, in fact, pardon his sons, Don Jr. and Eric, and his daughter Ivanka, and even his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Would he pardon them for any potential offenses that they too have committed against the United States from the time that they held office, or in the case of the senior Trump's son and the senior daughter, and in the case of the son-in-law, but also for any offenses that Eric might have committed. And we can only guess at this point what kinds of federal laws might have been broken by the Trump children. At this point, it's idle speculation, but the very fact that it's been the subject of intense national discussion and debate, this question of whether or not Donald Trump, as president, might pardon his children in a preemptive pardon to spare them punishment for whatever actions that they might have taken that result in offenses against the United States. The answer very clearly is yes, he may pardon his children. The pardon power has been used by previous presidents to pardon family members. As I shared with you last time out, President Bill Clinton pardoned his brother. There's nothing off limits about a president pardoning his family. The prohibition here, as we've said before, is on a presidential self-pardon. In a related question, 3 or 4 of you asked, what is the importance of the prohibition in the pardon clause that stops a president from granting pardons in cases of impeachment? Well, this is all about the history that shaped the pardon power. In 1688, when the English king was set to pardon a loyal aide who had done the king's bidding, in going around to European nations, hat in hand, so to speak, seeking contributions for the king to raise an army and a navy to make war on other nations, in violation of the specific prohibition by Parliament. The king's loyal aide, Danby, Lord Danby, was impeached by Parliament, impeached by the House of Commons. And when the king learned about this, he came down to the Commons and said, I won't permit you to pardon Lord Danby. And the House responded with its own thunder. If you dare to pardon him in the case of this impeachment, you will witness yet another civil war. In a century filled with civil wars, the king had no appetite for another. He withdrew his pardon, and Lord Danby, for his crime of carrying out the king's bidding in violation of parliamentary prohibitions, was sent off to the Tower of London. Poor Danby. But the framers of the Constitution, whom we've previously said were keen students of history and developed their sense of government and constitutional reasoning and constitutional architecture against this backdrop of Anglo-American legal history, drew upon that incident and inserted that in Article 2 so as to specifically prohibit the president from pardoning people in cases of impeachment. How might this apply? Let's say that some cabinet member in the Trump administration were on trial for impeachable offenses. This clause would prohibit the president from coming down to Congress, as it were, and granting a pardon, which would stop the exercise of the impeachment power. Why was this so important to the framers? Because you'll recall the framers of our Constitution viewed the impeachment power as the ultimate way to protect our constitutional republic, specifically to protect our republic against a president with unlimited ambition, with no sense of restraint imposed by the Constitution or the laws of the United States. And so you can see that the impeachment power, as we've said before, was at all points the ultimate guardrail against presidential abuse of power. Other questions about the pardon power raised by you continue to fascinate me. One from a Canadian viewer, our friend in Canada, who says the pardon power is too sweeping. It's obvious that the president has too much power and it should be withdrawn. I have to say, I quite agree. And in fact, over the years, I've written in scholarly venues that the presidential pardon power should be checked by what would become a constitutional amendment, in this case, the 28th Amendment of the Constitution. My own view is that in those rare cases where a president might abuse the power to promote his own interest or to protect himself or shield himself from legal inquiries or criminal activities, that there should be a check available. And in my own view, that check should be a power in the hands of both the House and the Senate to exercise against the president. In my view, that anytime the House and the Senate want to check, that is to overrule a presidential pardon power, then it could do so by virtue of a two-thirds vote in both chambers. Now, if you consider this in the historical context of the exercise of the pardon power throughout American history, you'd understand that this would rarely happen. In fact, the Congress doesn't often pay a lot of attention, frankly, to the exercise of presidential pardons, except in those very controversial cases. But in those extremely rare cases, where, as I say, a president might desire to pardon himself or pardon somebody else to shield or protect himself, then I think Congress ought to have the authority to check or overrule the exercise of that pardon power. And so that's why years ago, I introduced the idea that, in fact, the Congress should possess this checking power. It's not been taken up, but over time, after enough significant abuses of power occur, then you can actually motivate members of Congress to proceed. Maybe if President Trump does decide to pardon himself, this might be the right circumstance to provoke Congress to consider such a constitutional amendment. Other questions arising from your wonderful comments, 700 or so strong, are particularly fascinating. And one of those questions is, what about this question of what Congress is going to do on January 6th when it gathers to count the Electoral College votes? A lot of anxiety surrounding what has always been, or mostly has been, a ceremonial action. Here's what happens on January 6th, just to refresh your minds. The full Congress meets in the House of Representatives. The Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, attends to the vote counting in his role as President of the Senate. And what he does, quite simply, is to open the envelope, so to speak, and tellers, those people who have been appointed by the House and the Senate, to read the electoral votes as they roll in from state to state to state. Now, we already know the results, of course, because the members of the Electoral College, the electors, met on, so to speak, in their own states on December 14th. And we know President-elect Joe Biden has won 306 electoral votes, more than enough to guarantee his victory. Now, what's the anxiety about? As you may know, President Trump has been urging some members of the conservative caucus to actually challenge the count when the mail, so to speak, is open, when the envelopes are open. What does a challenge amount to? Under the law, if in fact there is going to be a successful challenge to the electoral votes from a particular state, then the law requires that a member of the House and a member of the Senate must agree to officially challenge the results from that particular state. And understand there could be several challenges of the electoral results from state to state to state. And we all know that what President Trump and his few supporters in the House and perhaps the Senate are suggesting is challenging the electoral votes from the swing states, such as Michigan and Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, that President Trump would need to win and overturn the election results in order to hang on to power. So what this means is when the count is introduced, let us say, with respect to the state of Pennsylvania, that a member of the House, at this point, a member of the House from Georgia, has indicated that he intends to challenge it. If he mounts a challenge and he has a counterpart in the US Senate, then the two of them can make the official challenge. What happens at that point? Then both houses essentially reconvene in their own chambers, and they have 2 hours to discuss and debate the possibility of voting against the vote as submitted to the Congress and to the House and the Senate on January 6th. This is what amounts to an official challenge. Now, this is not going to go anywhere. Here's why. Because under the law, if in fact the challenge is mounted in the House, then the House would take a vote to determine whether or not it's going to agree with the challenge to the electoral votes in this hypothetical case that we're raising in the state of Pennsylvania. But remember which party controls the House of Representatives. It's a majority enjoyed by the Democrats. So there's no way that Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, would allow this vote to go forward. And while it's also possible that a senator or two might try to mount a challenge in that body, the upper chamber, Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, has publicly said he does not want any Republicans to mount the challenge. So first of all, any willingness on the part of a senator on the Republican side who would be willing to mount a challenge has to overcome the opposition of the Senate leader, and that's considerable. But think about why the Senate leader does not want Republican senators to, in fact, challenge the election results. It's because it would put Republican senators in that very awkward position of having to vote in one way to sustain the electoral vote as it stands. Thus, they would be crossing President Trump. And at this point, given all of the political crosswinds across our nation, members of the Republican Party are not keen to cross the president. So it puts them in that tough position of either voting to support President Trump's ongoing efforts to subvert the election through baseless claims and assertions without any factual evidence that the election was rigged, or in fact to do their duty and to simply vote to uphold the electoral votes as submitted to Congress. My guess is that Senate Majority Leader McConnell is going to be successful in suppressing any tendency or desire on the part of Republican senators to challenge the vote on January 6th. there may be one or two in the House, maybe a handful who want to challenge it. What happens if you have one House challenging and the other not? Then, in effect, then the matter is closed because both chambers have to agree to uphold the challenge. And under the law, if there is a split decision, so to speak, and we're not even going to get close to a split decision, which would be characterized by the full House, let us say, voting to challenge, but the Senate declining, then under the law, the vice president is required to accept the certification of a state's electoral vote as presented by the chief executive of that particular state. And as we've already seen, the chief executive of those swing states are all Democrats. So, game over. At this point, we might wonder, as you ask, will President Trump ever concede? I don't think he's going to concede this election. He is so committed to this ongoing effort to try to overturn the election results. And at this point, as you all know, he has exhausted every legal, every constitutional remedy. He's been in 50 to 60 courts. He is yet to prevail. And on this important point, I would like all of you to know that even though publicly President Trump continues to maintain that the election was rigged, that the election was stolen, or this morning that hundreds of thousands of ballots were dumped in the dark of night in all of these swing states, hundreds of thousands of ballots cast for Donald Trump. These statements, these false assertions, baseless assertions, in conjunction with the claims by other aides and cronies out there making the same public assertions, have not been made in courts of law. That's important to remember because some 70 million Americans, strong supporters of President Trump, might have been affected by the president's claim that the election is rigged and stolen. But here's what all of you have to ask yourselves. If, in fact, these allegations are true, if, in fact, these allegations are grounded in evidence, then ask yourself this question. Why aren't Trump's attorneys submitting evidence of a rigged election in the courts of law? Why are they not putting their names on paper to support these public charges? The answer is lawyers can be made to suffer professional discipline and punishment for making false statements in court. That's why Trump's attorneys are not making these statements in court, and they're not producing any evidence. Judge after judge has said, is there any evidence to support your assertion of fraud? No. Are there any facts to support your position? No. So there is a great disjunction between what is being said publicly and what is being said in courts of law. Anybody can say anything publicly. That is what the Trump administration has been doing, and it is a gross disservice to the American people and our American democracy to represent idly, that is falsely, that this election was rigged and stolen. It is a moment of great shame in the history of the Trump presidency that at this juncture, the president of the United States would be unwilling to accept the fact that he lost the election and that he is bent on doing perhaps everlasting harm to our American democracy by sowing seeds of doubt in the administration of our elections, sowing seeds of doubt in the confidence that Americans historically have possessed that our elections are free and fair. Ladies and gentlemen, I say to you in closing today, despite whatever your partisan feelings are, let us not engage in activity that will undermine for years to come the great institution that is a hallmark of American democracy, and that is that in America, we hold free and fair elections. Thanks so much for joining us today. We appreciate your participation and keep your questions coming. And by the way, the Alturas Institute is a nonprofit organization, always looking for supporters and donors. And if you are so moved, and I hope you are, please find us at Venmo at the Alturas Institute, or come to the Alturas Institute website, alturasinstitute.com, and shake loose a few pennies and dollars to support the Alturas Institute's ongoing effort to advance and defend American democracy. Thank you all so very much. Stay safe, stay healthy, have a happy holiday, and long live the Republic.